that most of the world's water flows through a very small number of rivers, and that most of the world's population lives in a very small number of cities, and that very few planets have almost all the planetary mass. And that also applies to stars. It applies to your blood vessels as well. A very small proportion of your blood vessels have the largest volume of flow. That's called a Pareto distribution, and Pareto distributions tend to characterize a certain proportion of natural systems. And so this proclivity for inequality to emerge is real, and the danger that capital will accumulate in the hands of a very small number of people is also real. But number one, it can't be attributed to capitalism, because every economic system that humans have ever employed produces a Pareto distribution. Now, but the problem there is that if you're a young person and maybe you're looking for a romantic adventure and you see inequality, it's going to grate on you emotionally, because who the hell is happy about the fact that there are disenfranchised street people, and then also people who are even perhaps, with a street person, you might say, well, you've made some bad life choices, but what do you say about poverty-stricken children, especially when they're poverty-stricken in the face of wealth? And so the idea that you're fighting on behalf of the oppressed is a pretty attractive proposition for a young person, even if they're not ideologically addled, right? And it's also a reality that makes conservatives guilty when they're faced with the moral onslaught of leftist activists, because, well, inequality is a painful reality. And the truth of the matter is we really don't know what to do about it. It's a very difficult problem to solve. And it's a complex, the solutions are complex. But then, you can be Che Guevara and you can have a nice flag in your bedroom and your relatives can tell you that you are a young hero in training. And that is a lot more attractive emotionally than, as you pointed out, the message of restraint, duty, and obligation, which is kind of the last thing a 13-year-old wants to hear when he's trying to make his adventurous way out in the world. This is a very big problem.
Yeah, and I'll tell you kind of how my views changed. And really my views changed significantly when I spent 5 years actually working on a documentary for PBS, looking at 3 forgotten American cities: Youngstown, Ohio, Memphis, Tennessee, and Stockton, California. I followed these families in some of the poorest zip codes in the country, a white neighborhood, a predominantly black neighborhood, and a predominantly Latino and mixed race neighborhood over the course of a few years, and really trying to understand this question. What is driving inequality? What does inequality look like? What does the phenomenon reveal about itself? And the answer was actually really my political turning point, the completion of my political education. And it's looking at it and saying, hey, wait a minute. It's not just a simple economic story. It's not a story of elites, kind of greed. It's not a story of that kind of left-wing ideology. And in fact, the fundamental human experience of inequality in America, in a kind of advanced industrial country, is one that actually is a complex social story. You have broken families. In one of the neighborhoods, for example, 92% of the families were single-parent homes. So there were no fathers in the home almost anywhere in the whole zip code. You look at the social pathologies, from depression, anxiety, to drug addiction, alcoholism. And then you look at the collapse of community institutions. So those mediating social institutions that once provided a structure, a sense of meaning, a sense of restraint, a sense of direction, they've all been evaporated. And all you get is the individual and the state. And the ultimate irony that I discovered was that in a place like Memphis, they're spending, I believe, something like $3 billion a year on means-tested anti-poverty programs for a small population, something around $30,000 per family per year. So enough to have a median standard of living, and yet you have a complete social disaster through and through. And so what that taught me was you have to look at the society, you have to look at cultural factors and kind of economic redistribution, which we already have in this country. The United States spends more than $1 trillion a year on its welfare programs. It cannot solve problems that are human, cultural, spiritual in nature. And so at that point, the left-wing narrative on inequality, those simple story, just could not meet the standard of reality that I saw and lived with for 4 years.
Well, one of the things One of the things that's perverse about the leftist philosophy, and I would say this particularly about Marx, is that although the socialists, even the labor union socialist types who are much more forgivable, one of the things they presume is that, well, capitalism is bad, and there's an implicit presumption there that there's actually something wrong with the entire monetary exchange system and perhaps something wrong with the idea of money per se. But all you have to do to address social problems is redistribute money. And that is it's such a primordial, it's such a primitive and unsophisticated theory because, as you pointed out, if you do delve into these situations in depth, one of the things you find is that things are so broken and damaged at the bottom end of the socioeconomic pyramid, let's say, that the provision of money is not going to help in the least. Like I had clients, for example, who were part of the excluded class, let's say, and they actually didn't do too badly when they didn't have much money. But as soon as their unemployment or disability check showed up, their narcissistic and psychopathic friends would descend like a plague of vultures, and they'd be off to the bar for like a 3-day cocaine and alcohol, party to the point of unconsciousness. And I'd have clients that would find themselves face down in a ditch, the next Tuesday morning. And the idea that you can just dump excess resources into a structure that has no structure is the sort of thing that a deluded Che Guevara worshiping 13-year-old could assume, but that bears absolutely no relationship whatsoever to how much trouble real trouble is and how little mere money can do about it.
Yeah, that's right. And I think that they also make the fundamental mistake that they look at redistribution as the miracle, right? The miracle solution. But in fact, production is the miracle. For almost all of human history, we produced very little per capita. And so with capitalist production, which is presupposed in the Marxist economic analysis, this is a miracle. The fact that we have the standard of living that we have, the fact that we've been able to reduce extreme poverty globally by such a large extent in the last 30, 40, 50 years as India and China moved away from a more socialist and centrally planned system. That is a miracle. It's a miracle of human invention. And so I think that at the same time, you feel a sense of guilt almost naturally because you see this great abundance. And then you see its distribution. But the question of how to solve that is very complex. It's very difficult. And to dovetail on what you were saying, it's like I've spent times in these poor neighborhoods, and then I found like